Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this announcement of our next phase of the Freedom from Facebook and Google campaign effort. I'm David Siegel. I'm the Executive Director of Demand Progress. We'll spend most of the afternoon looking forward, but I wanted to begin by taking a look back at where we've come from. So 5 years ago, big tech was still the darling of Washington, D.C., with a caravan of untold prominent officials decamping to Silicon Valley in search of fortune. Yet today it's becoming accepted in the halls of power and across varied elements of the ideological spectrum that the government needs to bring these platforms into the realm of small d democratic control and restructure online markets to ensure that they work better for our economy and broader society. The Bill of Grievances will now sound pretty familiar. These companies warp the information ecosystem by elevating incendiary and hateful content to keep people clicking, while at other times they're unduly censorious and stifle speech. They patrol broad swaths of the economy in so-called kill zones, where new businesses can't get funded because it's reasonably assumed that a handful of behemoths will use a variety of anti-competitive tools to undercut them before they even get off the ground. They run advertising monopolies that have siphoned away funds that used to support professionalized journalism, and they wield troves of data to manipulate their users and extract as much as possible from them. We launched this coalition as Freedom from Facebook just a few years ago, almost exactly 3 years ago. And it's amazing to consider how much has changed since then. As we launched, the Federal Trade Commission was investigating the Cambridge Analytica scandal, and we proposed a remedy that at the time seemed utterly outrageous, that only structural changes, like unwinding Facebook's acquisitions of WhatsApp and Instagram, and other restructuring of their business model would prevent further privacy violations over years to come. And quite a lot has happened since then. For one thing, that initial demand, while seeming kind of crazy to a lot of DC insiders, was perceived as dangerous enough to Facebook that they sicked an opposition research firm on us and our coalition members. Then in 2019, the FTC issued a fine of $5 billion to settle the Cambridge Analytica proceeding, and it was a record, but 2 of the 5 commissioners opposed it because it didn't go far enough, in part because it didn't touch the underlying structures as we had demanded. Then last fall, the FTC and dozens of states sued to break up Facebook, naming theories of harm and proposing remedies that dovetail with this coalition's very earliest demands. And last year, as the DOJ and states attorneys general began to investigate potential Google antitrust violations, we expanded the coalition to more directly encompass a critique of that company as well, and to try to ensure bipartisanship and scrutiny of it during these unusually polarizing times. We've since seen multiple major lawsuits filed attacking Google's dominance in search and in advertising. In Congress, the House Judiciary Committee's antitrust subcommittee completed a historic investigation into the business models of the dominant platforms, and members of our coalition and allies are helping to ensure that its findings are transformed into landmark legislation that can meaningfully reform the markets in which these companies are situated. And a bit later on this afternoon, we'll hear from Congressman Mattjones, who serves on that subcommittee. With the wind at our back and a new administration in office, we've entered a phase wherein, with appropriate political will and with the right personnel in place, we can win these fights and reclaim a vision for an internet that helps speech, democracy, and entrepreneurship to flourish. Over the course of the afternoon, we'll be hearing from allies, new and old, about why they're taking part in our coalition And it's fitting that we'll start with the message from one of the longest standing and most prominent allies, Senator Elizabeth Warren. Her speech at an event put on by OMI during the summer of 2016, which called for breaking up the major platforms, brought new attention to these issues. And she remains a stalwart ally of those fighting to reduce concentration and to increase beneficial competition in markets both online and off. So now we welcome a message from Senator Warren.
Hello, and thank you for inviting me to join you today. I'm sure sorry that we couldn't do this in person, but I am grateful for this chance to pass along this message. I want to start with a big thank you to the Freedom from Facebook and Google Coalition for bringing us together today. You all do powerfully important work to drive bold, progressive change forward, and I am grateful down to my toes for all that you do. I also want to give a special shout out to my colleague, Congressman Mattjones. Go, Mondaire. Congressman Jones is off to a running start in Congress, and I am thrilled that he's here with us today. 30 years ago, Facebook, Google, and Amazon did not exist. Now they are among the most valuable and best known companies in the entire world. Now, it's a great story, but it is also a story about the dangers of monopolies and anti-competitive actions. Today's big tech companies have grown so giant and so powerful that they threaten our economy, our society, and our very democracy. They have bulldozed competition, used private information for profit, and tilted the playing field against everyone else. In the process, they have stifled small businesses and innovation, and they have threatened our democratic processes. We must hold these big tech companies accountable and break them up so that there's real competition and so that our democracy is not held hostage to their desire to make more and more money. We need to make sure that the next generation of great American tech companies has a chance to grow and flourish. And to do that, we need government regulations that make sure that everybody, even the biggest and most powerful companies in America, that everybody plays by the rules. We need to stop this generation of big tech companies from throwing around their political power to shape the rules in their favor. We need to stop them from throwing around their economic power to buy up every potential competitor. Just this past year, the FTC and 48 states recognized what I've been arguing for a long time. Companies like Facebook snuff out competition. That's exactly what they did when they bought Instagram and WhatsApp. And this case demanding that Facebook unwind those purchases is a huge first step in the fight to break up big tech. As big tech companies like Facebook and Google face growing scrutiny, we have a huge opportunity in Congress to make big structural change and finally hold these powerful companies accountable. We do that by enshrining strong antitrust principles into new legislation. We do that by reviving serious antitrust enforcement at both the FTC and the DOJ. And we do that by fighting monopolies in any industry that threaten our economy, our society, and our democracy. If we all make our voices heard, we can take power away from the wealthy and well-connected in Washington, and we can put it back where it belongs, in the hands of the people. So, to all of you here, I am grateful for all that you do and grateful for all that you will do. Keep up the great work. It's an honor to fight alongside you.
Thank you so much to Senator Warren, not only for making the time to support and encourage what I think can now definitively be called a movement to take on the vast power of Facebook and Google, but in many ways for launching that movement to begin with. As many of you know, and David referenced, Senator Warren was the first political leader to speak out a short 4.5 years ago or so about the dangers of tech platform power. Then, of course, she's continued to speak out, to raise the alarm and educate the public to generate momentum for the cause we're all here to talk about today, breaking up Facebook and Google to help ensure that they're safe for democracy and can no longer perpetuate the long litany of harms that so many of the groups in this coalition have been working so hard to prevent. My name is Sarah Miller. I'm the Executive Director of the American Economic Liberties Project, and our mission is to push, pressure, and support policymakers to disperse concentrated power in our economy, including, of course, through one of the most conceptually simple approaches, which would be breakups. Today, I think it's fair to say that the notion that Facebook, Google, and other dominant tech platforms are simply too big and powerful has been mainstreamed, and that the systemic failure of antitrust enforcers and policymakers is a big reason for that. That's why I'm so grateful for the partnership and collaboration of the 15 new organizations who've joined up with the original 20 or so members of Freedom from Facebook and Google to turn what is now, I think, conventional wisdom into reality. But whether you look to Congress, the new administration, or to state attorneys general and legislatures, big change is now on the table and in reach. So thank you so much to our new partners for adding their perspectives to this work, helping us accelerate our momentum even more, and to our original crop of collaborators who jumped on relatively early back in mid-2018, and also to David and Demand Progress, who partnered with us to organize this effort from the jump. Now, it's my privilege to introduce a very special guest to share a few remarks with us this afternoon. I'm so pleased that Congressman Mattjones could join us to talk about the importance of taking on Facebook and Google's power and share his insights on the opportunities and obstacles advocates should be mindful of as momentum continues to build. As you all know, Congressman Jones is a member of the House Antitrust Subcommittee and the Congressional Progressive Caucus, and just yesterday, in fact, I think, was named the most active freshman member of Congress, having sponsored or co-sponsored nearly 300 pieces of legislation since taking his seat in January. In his role on the Antitrust Subcommittee, Congressman Jones has not shied away from demanding structural change rather than small ball solutions, or calling out tech industry influence when he sees it. Congressman Jones, thank you so much for your leadership. We're excited to see what comes next and thrilled you can join us today. Let me hand the floor over to you for a few minutes.
Well, thank you so much, Sarah, and Senator Warren for those kind words and for the generous introduction. Thank you to everyone involved in the Freedom from Facebook and Google Coalition for reconvening for this truly vital work. And thank you to everyone here today for making this anti-monopoly movement a reality. We have all heard that with great power comes great responsibility. But no matter how much we wish that were true, Facebook and Google are teaching us a different lesson. With monopoly power comes no responsibility. The facts speak for themselves. By acquiring, copying, or killing rising competitors, Facebook and Google have monopolized digital advertising and their core businesses, social networking, and general search. Their power over the ad market has made a robust local and diverse press unsustainable. Their power over social media and search has amplified extremist and illegal content, from white nationalism to weapons sales. They wield that power to entrench themselves even more. And who pays the price? Small and local businesses, journalists, workers, and the American people writ large. The biggest tech platforms are so powerful that, as Mark Zuckerberg says, today, Facebook is more like a government than a traditional company. But Zuckerberg's online government is anything but a democracy. Facebook and Google are unelected, unaccountable, and underhanded. So we stand at a pivotal moment then for our economy and our democracy. On one hand, corporations like Facebook and Google have consolidated unprecedented monopoly power. On the other hand, thanks to you, the movement against these monopolies is stronger than at any time since the original progressive era. Now is the time to renew our work to break them up. Consider this. After decades of inaction, our nation's antitrust enforcers, from the Federal Trade Commission and the Justice Department to the attorneys general of nearly every state, have finally mobilized to hold Facebook and Google accountable in court. That is a testament to your advocacy. But as you all know too well, we cannot count on the courts alone to get the job done. After all, the judiciary paved the way for today's Gilded Age. Over a century ago, the original progressives designed our antitrust statutes to prevent the concentrated economic power that we see today. But the right-wing takeover of the federal courts that began in the 1970s betrayed that congressional intent. Judges became more fearful of the government enforcing the law than of big corporations breaking it. And the Roberts Court is the most pro-corporate Supreme Court in generations. Just last month, the court stripped the FTC of its power to win financial compensation for the victims of corporate fraud and scams. To take on these big tech monopolies, my colleagues and I on the Judiciary Committee, Subcommittee on Antitrust, are developing the most sweeping reinvigoration of our antitrust laws in a century. We are ready to strengthen our enforcement agencies. We are ready to check the sort of mergers and acquisitions that have created this crisis of consolidation, like Facebook's pivotal purchases of Instagram and WhatsApp and Google's acquisitions of DoubleClick and Android. And we are ready to end the self-dealing and abuses of power that have distorted our economy and denied small businesses a chance to compete. But even the most robust new restrictions will not be enough. To achieve real freedom from Facebook and Google, we must also break them up. Regulation and structural separation are not alternatives. In fact, they go hand in hand. The truth is we can only regulate these massive corporations effectively if we break them up. Without structural separation, these companies will have the same incentives to abuse their dominance that they do now, the same conflicts of interest that pit their profits against our privacy, our mental health, and our democracy. Without structural separation, these corporations will remain too big to regulate, and that is not a prediction, it is a description of their history. Facebook, for example, has been violating the law with near impunity for a decade now. In 2012, the FTC concluded that Facebook was unlawfully deceiving its users and violating their privacy. But rather than risk a long and complicated trial, the FTC settled with Facebook, ordering the company to right these wrongs. Facebook had other ideas. By 2019, the FTC found that Facebook was flagrantly flouting that settlement. Yet again, because the commission felt that it could not take on Facebook in court, it settled. Sure, the commission fined Facebook $5 billion, but Facebook's almost certainly has made more than $5 billion by breaking the law. A lot more. The company makes that much revenue, in fact, in a single month. Facebook and Google have learned that if they violate our laws, they won't be held accountable. They've learned that the rare times we do enforce the law, the penalties will be, relatively speaking, no more than speeding tickets. That is why successful regulation demands structural separation. Because these companies have learned that with monopoly power comes no responsibility. It is time for us to break up that power. This coalition is leading that fight. Without your years of activism, your organizing, and your voices, the DOJ and the FTC would never have initiated these cases against Google and Facebook. Without your advocacy, Congress would never have devoted 2 years to exposing these companies' monopoly power, on a bipartisan basis, no less. Imagine that. And I know that by opening this new chapter in our work today, we are setting this country on a path to freedom from Facebook and Google. Freedom from Facebook and Google is about so much more than the fate of two of the largest corporations the world has ever known. It is about freedom from an internet where the people are the products and privacy is a privilege. Freedom from an economy that puts profits over people. Freedom from the virtual platforms that enabled a real-world insurrection that I and my colleagues nearly died in a few months ago. Freedom from government of the corporations, by the corporations, and for the corporations. Freedom from Facebook and Google is also about the freedom to build a better world. It's about the freedom to create the economy and the democracy that we deserve freedom to start a small business without their permission, freedom to learn about our communities from diverse, independent local journalists, freedom to build and participate in online platforms that will not exacerbate systemic injustice, but unwind it. In short, freedom from Facebook and Google is about freedom, period. So I'm honored and excited to be with you in this work. Know that it will not be easy, but we will break them up together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Congressman, for those remarks. I think, we can only be as successful with leaders like you in Congress who are willing to stand up to power. And the example that you've set in just a few short months has been really inspiring to us as we reconvene and look towards solutions in the future. Let's spend a few minutes, if you don't mind, just asking a few questions. I think one of the things that we hear a lot when we talk to other members is, how does this issue resonate in my district? How do we see the manifestation of Facebook and Google's power in my district tangibly? How is it affecting people's lives? And a lot of us on this call sit here in DC. A number of us are also grassroots activists that are really deeply connected with different affected communities. So I'm curious, from your perspective, as you go out and talk to your constituents about these issues, how do you see it resonate? What is manifesting, and how does that connect with the suite of solutions, particularly breakups, that we're talking about today?
It's a question that I think brings out something essential. And that is, Google and Facebook are multinational corporations, right? But their dominance has local impacts in every community in the United States. I think about the free press, a cornerstone of our democracy. Today, Google and Facebook control nearly 60% of US advertising revenue. And their monopoly power has devastated newspapers, magazines, local broadcasters, and other outlets. When I think about the impacts on New York's 17th congressional district, my district, which includes Westchester and Rockland counties, I think about the challenges local journalists are facing making enough money to serve their communities. In my district, that means publications like Black Westchester. Before Black Westchester, many officials and organizations in the county were not reaching communities of color or even listening to them. And today, Black Westchester helps bridge that gap. That's why Black Westchester has always been available online for free. But lately, the ad revenue they depend on is harder and harder to come by. And as the antitrust subcommittee's report makes clear, that's because of how Facebook and Google have consolidated control over the digital advertising market. It's just one reason why it's so important that we break up these two massive corporations. Unless we restore competition to the digital advertising market, we cannot reinvigorate the press our democracy depends on.
That's a huge focus for us too. I mean, we see the way that Facebook and Google have systematically rolled up all of the advertising dollars and resulted in a real crisis in newspapers and journalism. But also this kind of leads into my next question for you, which is disinformation and misinformation and its impact on the communications ecosystem, particularly in the context of a strong democracy and well-informed citizenry. I think a lot of folks on this call in particular have been real leaders in fighting disinformation that the platforms generate and profit from. And we're starting to see, I think, an important strategic partnership between those organizations and for the organizations that have traditionally been thinking about business models and breakups. So from your perspective, can you share how, and as you mentioned, you were in the Capitol, on January 6th, and I think it was remarkable to see how quickly it was accepted that, the business models of Facebook and Google, both over the longer term, set the stage for that, and then were critical tools in the planning and execution of that attack. But how do you kind of think about disinformation and misinformation and breakups and the relationship between that policy remedy and that particularly, I think, acute and dangerous problem?
Yeah. Let us acknowledge that right now, Facebook and Google control much of the essential infrastructure for what should be our democratic discourse. Whether someone wants to plan a peaceful protest or launch a violent insurrection at the Capitol, Facebook and Google provide the platforms and wield the power to decide who can use them and how. According to Facebook's own research, nearly 2/3 of the time someone joined an extremist group, they joined because Facebook's own algorithms recommended it. And YouTube, which obviously is owned by Google, is little better. And so there are three reasons breaking up Facebook and Google is so important addressing these content moderation problems that you alluded to. First, the more competition there is for online platforms, the more options all of us have. Our democracy won't be captive to the rules set by one or two unaccountable corporations. Second, the more competition that there is, the more pressure even the dominant platforms will face to develop the rules we need for fair, equitable, accurate, and inclusive online spaces. And third, breaking up Facebook and Google will make it easier than ever to compel these companies to actually follow the law, rather than get away with profiting from enabling illegal conduct. And let me add one final point that's often left out of the content moderation conversation. Content moderation requires content moderators. These are real people who view vast volumes of troubling, often traumatizing content that's posted on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, or elsewhere. Facebook's monopoly power has enabled it to get away with abusing and exploiting these workers, subjecting them to brutal hours and denying them the fair pay and the mental health care that they deserve. Breaking up big tech, then, is also about justice for our workers.
Absolutely. Let me ask you just a few more questions. So you joined the House Antitrust Subcommittee a few months ago when you were seated in Congress. And obviously, over the last 2 years or so, they undertook one of the most rigorous investigations into monopoly power, I think, in the last 50 years, is fair to say, and came out with a suite of recommendations that are laying the groundwork for what you spoke about in your remarks earlier, aggressive and bold legislative reform. I guess it's a two-part question. What sets of recommendations most resonated with you coming out of that, and do you feel like are most important? And then what do you see in terms of the path forward for those bold and I think essential legislative moves over the course of this Congress?
Well, let me start by commending Chairman David Cicilline and his entire team for what I think we all recognize was a comprehensive and compelling report. And now it's been an honor to join the committee as it continues its investigative work, holding power to account, oftentimes on a bipartisan basis. And I was, of course, proud to vote to approve the report during the full committee's markup last month. This report on competition in digital markets is over 400 pages long. But to me, its message can be summarized in approximately 2 sentences. The big tech companies are too powerful, and the solution to that problem is to break them up. So I'm excited that the full Judiciary Committee approved a report expressly recommending that Congress enact legislation facilitating structural separation and imposing line of business restrictions. To me, that means the committee recognizes structural separation must be a top priority. Additionally, I would say that I'm also focused on ensuring we prevent mega mergers of the kind that created this crisis of consolidation in the first place. And we don't, if we do not impose clear rules against these mergers, we are inviting the formation of monopolies in the future.
And let me ask you just one more question before we let you get back to work. What advice do you have for grassroots activists, for progressive organizations who are taking on this fight, so we can be most effective in supporting, I think, exactly the types of big, bold legislative changes that are urgent and necessary to solve this problem?
I love this question.
Good.
Facebook and Google are not going to break themselves up, right? Quite the opposite, in fact. In the last 15 years or so, they've acquired upwards of a couple hundred companies without facing any meaningful pushback from the FTC. The reason Facebook and Google are even facing federal antitrust action today, finally, bolstered by suits by nearly every state attorney general in the nation, is that people and organizations like yours rose up and built a bipartisan movement demanding a new generation of trust busting. And as a member of the antitrust subcommittee, I got to tell you, the same is going to be true of Congress. We need you to inspire members of Congress to stand up to corporate lobbyists. We need you to convince my colleagues that we must act now and act boldly. And above all, we need you to make the case for breaking them up. If we really want an economy and a democracy that put people over profits, we are going to need the people to show up and demand that future.
Thank you so much, Congressman. I think that's a great note to end on. We're going to turn to our panel and to my colleague, Morgan Harper, but we are so excited to see you on the Antitrust Subcommittee. We're glad it seems to be a popular place to be. And just, I think thinking back to 3 or so years ago when we launched this coalition, it's just remarkable to see the change that's occurred and the leadership that's developed, and you're at the forefront of that. So grateful for your time today and for your leadership on the subcommittee and in Congress.
Thank you for your leadership. Thank you for the invitation to say a few words today. And please keep it up because you are making a difference every single day. Take care.
Thank you, Congressman Jones. Bye. All right, I want to turn it over to my colleague, Morgan Harper. Morgan is Economic Liberties Director of Policy and Advocacy. She will introduce our fantastic roster of speakers today. Morgan is an alum of the CFPB. She is a former congressional candidate, and she has been a real leader since joining us in the fight to break them up. Morgan?
Thank you, Sarah, and just want to thank both Senator Warren and Congressman Jones again for kicking us off. So I have the distinct pleasure of just demonstrating, introducing some new members of our movement and the power of the movement. And we're really excited to have so many people who could join us today to speak on behalf of their organizations about why breaking up Facebook and Google matters to them. So we're just going to get right to it. I'm going to kick it off with Jennifer Epps Addison, who is the network president and co-executive director of the Center for Popular Democracy, to share her organization's thoughts on why this is such an urgent issue. Hi, Jennifer.
Hello, and thank you so much. I want to say, as people can probably tell from my background, I am much more comfortable in community when we are face to face and building power together than I am talking to a camera. So you'll forgive me if I just talk like we're in the room together and we're in this fight, because we really are. And this moment, I want to thank the Freedom from Facebook and Google Coalition, particularly the OGs, the original coalition members who have gotten the movement to this incredibly powerful point. I want to thank the leadership of Senator Warren and Congressman Jones, who is the most active freshman in Congress, and so glad to have his leadership on this issue. Look, the truth is that this is personal, and this is far more than just personal. We are a network of grassroots organizations in 36 states, Puerto Rico, and Washington, D.C. And, our members spent the last year, really the last 4 years, going door to door in their communities, asking people to get involved in their democracy, overcoming a massive barriers, voter suppression, and really threats to participation, to having ownership in our democracy. We saw yet again Black women step up in ways and save this democracy. And what is at the heart of the threat, right, is this big tech monopoly. When we talk about disinformation and we talk about, the ways that big tech harms our democracy and people's involvement, what we're really talking about are misinformation campaigns that are primarily targeting Black folks and brown folks who are already struggling in this community, who are trying to dissuade us from participation, who are just trying to dissuade us from owning our power, who are trying to prevent us, as Representative Jones said, from building the country of our dreams and the country our families deserve. When I think about, all of those incredible Black women in Georgia who, despite all of those barriers, helped move millions of new voters to the polls, they weren't just up against white supremacy. They weren't just up against people standing at their polling places with guns. They were up against the most rich and powerful corporations in this country who were facilitating misinformation and facilitating the violence that they were experiencing on the ground every day. Our communities deserve better. So the Center for Popular Democracy is incredibly proud to stand with the other members of the Freedom from Google and Facebook Coalition, And, we want to make clear that for our members, there isn't a kinder, gentler way to peddle white supremacy, right? This is about what side of history we are on. And you are either on the side that profits from hate and propaganda and harm, or you are on the side that believes that a powerful, multiracial democracy that is for and by the people is possible in our lifetime. And so we are clear. Nothing short of breaking up these platforms will do. We have seen policy failure after policy failure, reform after reform, broken promise after broken promise from these tech giants, all while they continue to rake in billions of dollars at the expense of our people. We have had enough. This is a question of political courage, and we are so glad to see that a bipartisan group of elected officials are listening to the people and are finally taking note about how risky and dangerous allowing these monopolies to continue are, not just for our lives, but for the very democracy that so many of us gave our blood, sweat, and tears for in the middle of a pandemic to make sure that we had a voice. So we are proud to join with this coalition. We are going to continue to organize our people, and we are going to continue to make clear that we deserve freedom. We deserve choices. We deserve the ability to not be profited off of, and instead for the internet to be a resource and a tool that aids in a flourishing democracy, not one that undermines it and puts it at risk.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. We are so proud to have the Center for Popular Democracy as part of the coalition, and want to thank you and all of your members for joining the coalition and putting your people power behind this movement. So thank you for those remarks, and welcome. Welcome to the fold. We're off, baby. Okay. And so next we're going to have Edgar Comellas, who is the owner of Aces Wild Entertainment and also a member of the Main Street Alliance, another new coalition member. We'll hear from Edgar. So you have the floor.
Hi, well, thank you everybody for having me here, and thank you everybody for joining us in this video from Facebook and Google. As mentioned, my name is Edgar Comellas. I'm the owner of Aces Wild Entertainment. 8 years running personal business, started in my garage, and I am all over the state of Florida. Meaning that we service the entire state. Also, I'm a member of the Main Street Alliance, a group of over 30,000 individual small business owners that cover the entire country. Small businesses have a big stake in this fight. Facebook and Google's monopolistic practices have meant that small businesses cannot compete, even when we work within their monopoly control. We have rising engagement rates and fees. We have declining returns and limited avenues for any resources. The syndicate of digital advertising has meant that small businesses are getting squeezed at every angle. We have to pay to reach the followers that we already pay to obtain. We have to pay outside consultants to work on our SEO or to continue to update content to fit Google's best practices, because otherwise we can never compete and we can't show up in the top results because we're being overspent by larger companies. In my industry, national companies crowd out local individuals and local businesses, even when they don't provide services in this specific area. Facebook and Google prey on small business owners. They arbitrarily delist small businesses, allow scams and counterfeit products to proliferate, and refuse to provide any kind of reliable customer service, even for the individuals that are forced to work within their platforms. I myself have had to actively fight reviews and changes in my business with little to no recourse. At the end of the day, there's nobody that you can actually speak to in these platforms. What is more frustrating is to see Facebook using the small business as a reason to attack our privacy laws and practices, when small businesses are being held captive, unable to reach their own customers. In the last 2 years, I've had to increase my ad budget by 50% just to reach the same growth levels. The algorithms, misleading sale results, and the upselling sale taxes ensure that a small business owner continue to spend money with little to no benefit to them. Nothing short of breaking up these platforms will do. Serious policy failures have allowed big tech to build unaccountable monopolies with destructive, abusive, and discriminatory business models. And as we have seen, this has great implications for our democracy, not just a small business economy. Regulation is important, but alone it is not enough. Addressing the powers means breaking them up. The tech monopolies are now the biggest corporate lobbying spenders in the country, bigger than telecom, defense contracting, oil, or big tobacco. Luckily, there is bipartisan momentum to tackle this big tech, but only if we keep up the pressure. Congress and the Biden administration have the ability, the responsibility, and the drive to break up these corporate behemoths and revive our democracy and to achieve a racial, gender, and economic justice. On behalf of Main Street Alliance and small businesses everywhere, we thank you for adding our voice to your fight.
Thank you so much, Edgar. Because this is one of the key talking points that you'll often hear from big tech, from Facebook and Google is, oh, we're here to support small businesses. So it's so important to hear the perspective from you, Edgar, and from other members of Main Street Alliance about how it's actually they're implementing predatory tactics that prevent you from doing business. And we're really grateful to have you all as part of the coalition. So next, we're going to go to Katie Riley, who is the campaign director for Ultraviolet. Katie, turning it over to you.
Thanks, Morgan. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, thank you. Well, I'm excited to be here today, and I wanted to start with a story that unfortunately will be familiar to a lot of women. A few years ago, I had a stalker on Facebook. A man I'd never met began harassing me and sending disturbing messages to me and my friends. When I blocked him, he just made a new profile. I felt unsafe, not just on Facebook, but everywhere I went. I reported him to Facebook several times, but nothing happened until someone connected me with an employee at Facebook to finally get this person completely banned. It is unacceptable that it took an inside connection for a woman who was being harassed on Facebook to get help from the platform. So I'm proud to be here today representing Ultraviolet and our community of over 1 million people fighting for a safer internet for women and girls of all backgrounds. Studies show that as a woman, a person with a disability, and a member of the LGBTQ community, my identities put me at a higher risk of being targeted and harassed online. And it's even worse for Black, Indigenous, women of color, and transgender women who face an onslaught of both racist and misogynist attacks while the platforms profit off of these harms. So it's no surprise that Pew Research found that 3/4 of Black and Latinx people and 2/3 of women say that online harassment is a major problem. And this isn't a coincidence. It is intentionally built into the system. After all, the predecessor to Facebook was a site that Mark Zuckerberg designed to rate women at Harvard by their looks. And the algorithms and policies on Facebook and Google have been created in large part by privileged men who recreate their own biases in the algorithms. Clickbait, conspiracies, and disinfo keep people on the platforms and put money in the pockets of billionaire CEOs. And nothing short of breaking up these monopolies will change their hate for profit business models. Online hate and disinformation are used by extremist groups like the Proud Boys and the 3%ers to recruit and radicalize new members. Facebook and Google's algorithms serve up content that makes it easy for a user to fall down a rabbit hole from relatively innocent content to extremist, misogynist, white supremacist views as algorithms serve up more and more extreme videos, groups, and posts. Online misogyny is proven to fuel gender-based violence, mass shootings, and hate crimes. In fact, many of the participants in the January 6th attacks on the US Capitol had a history of abusing women on and offline. Social media companies have a responsibility to stop the spread of hate and violence on their platforms and protect their users. But they have refused, and any efforts they do make are too little too late. It took an attack on the US Capitol and the death of 5 people for social media companies to finally remove the Stop the Steal conspiracies. They have shown time and time again that they cannot regulate themselves. So now is the time for lawmakers to step in and break up big tech monopolies to protect people and democracy itself. Our democracy relies on a system of checks and balances to prevent one person or institution from holding too much power. Yet we're letting tech companies run amok, interfering with our elections, worsening the pandemic, and spreading hate that leads directly to violent attacks like those in Charlottesville, Atlanta, El Paso, and even the US Capitol. Mark Zuckerberg has no checks or balances. As the CEO, the controlling shareholder, and the chair of the board, he is his own boss. He is the sole decider for what constitutes free speech, hate, and harassment on the top 4 most downloaded apps over the last 10 years. This power to decide what will and will not remain on their sites makes social media companies the gatekeepers of critical communication and commercial infrastructure, and gives them the ability to influence the worldview of billions of users by determining what content people see and what is excluded. Now is the time to rein in the unchecked power of Facebook and Google's monopolies, to protect our democracy and give people more choice over how they communicate online. I still don't feel safe on social media, but like many people in the US, I need it for my job and to stay in touch with family, friends, and community. Social media has become an essential part of our daily lives that we cannot truly opt out of. Facebook and Google have too much power over our lives, too much access to our personal information, and too much ability to spread hate, false information, and extremism. And it is time to break them up. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. And one, thank you for sharing your story. I'm sorry that you had that experience, but we are so grateful that you're willing to open up about that and also use that experience to fuel this work and be part of a movement that is going to take on this power that is causing so much harm to so many people. So we're grateful to have Ultraviolet and all of your members as part of the coalition.
Thanks, we're excited to be here. Unfortunately, my story is far too common.
For sure. We're next going to turn to Leah Holland, who is the Campaigns and Communications Director at Fight for the Future, to hear from their organization.
Thank you so much, Morgan. It's a true pleasure to be joining in on the Freedom from Facebook and Google Coalition's celebration of winning the popular consciousness on these truly essential issues. Fight for the Future is a digital rights organization with 2 million members nationwide that is best known as the digital backbone of the largest online protests in human history to stop internet censorship legislation like SOPA, oppose mass surveillance and data harvesting, and defend net neutrality and internet access for all. These principles have led us to take a stand against Facebook and Google because their surveillance capitalist monopolies are incompatible with basic human rights and democracy. Last week, we co-launched endchildsurveillance.com, the first mass mobilization of parents to end big tech's exploitation of kids for profit. Throughout the process of launching this website, we were shocked by the weekly revelations around Facebook and YouTube violating their own rules, like Facebook allowing advertisers to target ads for anorexia content to kids as young as 13 who had happened to show an interest in diet food. The reality that no big tech company wants to cop to is that moderation is impossible given the scale of the internet. With 500 video uploads per minute on YouTube and 4,000 photo uploads per second on Facebook, there will always be bad content on the internet, and some will always point to it and demand censorship, even though censorship is both a harmful and unrealistic solution. No matter how much Facebook and Google insist that they can sanitize the internet, that solution is a misdirection to keep us from addressing the root of all this harm, their surveillance capitalist business model. For a while, speech itself was pointed to as the problem with big tech, rather than a manifestation of deeper social ills that cannot be solved by tweaking an algorithm. Artificial intelligence isn't a cure-all. It's only an extension of humanity. Having AI automate racism, sexism, ableism, or homophobia, or silence those communities is racist, sexist, ableist, and homophobic. The problem was never that Facebook and Google gave people a place to speak. The problem is that in the interest of monetizing said speech, these companies have developed sophisticated and massive infrastructure for manipulating people and artificially amplifying controversial content, all while creating a more addictive experience. They developed this infrastructure because of their surveillance capitalist business model, a cycle in which people are surveilled online, served ads, and then surveilled again in an endless loop of accruing ever more information to profit from. The efficacy of the ads based on this data is debatable, but what's clear is that advertisers are deep in the surveillance capitalist sauce. Facebook and Google are now lobbying titans with armies of suits working to protect their profit model at the expense of people and of democracy. And this brings me back to Facebook amplifying anorexia content to 13-year-olds. In lieu of breaking up these titanic companies, tech lobbyists are advocating for a different solution: to give Facebook and Google more power by repealing Section 230, by creating more restrictions and punishments for people's online speech. They fan the flames against Section 230 because they know that if lawmakers carve up this foundational law, it could leave the largest tech companies as the only ones standing, further cementing their monopoly while trampling human rights and free expression in the process. These are false solutions, and Facebook and Google know it. These companies are incapable of moderating at the scale of 500 videos per minute and 4,000 photos per second. No magic tech fix or AI solution is going to swoop down and change that. Giving them more power to moderate speech will only create more harm and marginalization. We need to give people meaningful control over their experiences, and that will not happen unless we break up big tech and their surveillance capitalist business model that is predicated on billions of people having minimal control or awareness of what is being done to them online. Essentially, what we have is our digital public square being run by a cadre of tech bros operating on the same fundamentals of consent depicted in the 1984 film Revenge of the Nerds. If we want to truly address harms to frontline vulnerable communities like children online, we need every functional tool in the toolbox, including robust antitrust and civil rights enforcement, FTC investigations, finally passing strong federal data privacy legislation, banning invasive corporate surveillance like facial recognition, and legislation that strikes at the root of the harm, algorithmic manipulation and data harvesting. The internet is more than Facebook and Google. It's time for the internet to become the place of global connection and self-discovery that we all know it can be. An engine for social movements fighting for racial, economic, and environmental justice and human rights around the world. It's time to break up Facebook and Google and give people, as well as the next generation of creators and activists, their digital power back. And that's why we're so happy to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leah. Those remarks were really powerful. I mean, I think that example of these platforms' willingness to prey on young women in particular at such a vulnerable time of life, it's disgusting, really. And you're absolutely right. I mean, content moderation is not possible. We have to break them up. And we are so happy to be in this fight with Fight for the Future and grateful to have you as part of the coalition.
Yeah, let's get them.
Let's do it. Next, we have Amy Taub, who is the Associate Director of Policy and Research at Demos, another new member to the Freedom from Facebook and Google Coalition. Amy.
Thank you, Morgan, and thanks to all the leaders who have spoken. We're hearing a really compelling indictment of the power of these companies today. I'm Amy Taub. I'm the Associate Director of Policy and Research at Demos. For folks who may not know us, Demos is a dynamic think tank that powers the movement for a just, inclusive, multiracial economy and democracy. Demos works to fight racial capitalism and autocracy through an interdisciplinary approach that combines legal expertise, research, advocacy, multi-platform communications, and deep partnerships with grassroots organizations from across the country. At Demos, we're looking at the way that Black and Brown communities are suffering disproportionately from the pandemic, from unemployment and economic displacement, and from the long-term continuing impacts of structural racism. While corporations like Facebook and Google are amassing record profits and exerting control over what we see, what we buy, and how we communicate with each other, and in the process reinforcing and deepening social inequalities. The reality is that tech platforms like Facebook and Google represent parts of our nation's essential infrastructure, just like the railroads, bridges, and telegraph lines of a century ago. And these companies effectively exercise unchecked private control over our essential social, economic, and political infrastructure. We sometimes hear objections about free markets or about the ability of Facebook and Google to self-regulate. But let's be clear, we live in an economy that is already heavily governed and regulated by Facebook and Google. Yet unlike government regulators, the decisions made by these private firms with this infrastructural power are not subject to mechanisms for democratic representation, participation, or any kind of public accountability. People in communities have no democratic voice. Without a government check on this tremendous concentration of private power, vital infrastructure is being essentially subverted for private profit rather than meeting our really urgent public needs. So at Demos, we have a lot of policy ideas for reining in the power of big tech. But one thing that is clear is that we do need to break these platforms up. I appreciate Representative Jones's point that regulation and structural separation are not opposites. They're not mutually exclusive. In fact, we think they go very well together. We need to regulate tech firms. We can establish public alternatives. We can demand a say in the algorithms used to make decisions about our lives. And we can work to give people greater control over their own data, especially communities that have been marginalized. We need to do all of that, but actually breaking up these unaccountable monopolies is an essential part of reducing their power. And so Demos is proud to be part of this coalition, and I am tremendously encouraged by the momentum that we see in Washington today to do that. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Amy. And we're really proud to have Demos, such a smart policy think tank, as part of this coalition. We're just going to keep going. We're growing, we're building, and we're happy to have Demos as part of the movement.
Glad to be part of it.
Thank you so much. Next, we have Stephen. Next, and last but not least, we have Stephen Ronderos, who is the Executive Director of Media Justice. Stephen.
Thank you, Morgan, and the rest of the American Economic Liberties Project team for inviting us to this event. Media Justice is actually really proud to be joining the Freedom from Facebook and Google campaign. For years, we've been fighting to hold these large tech platforms accountable for the harm that they've caused in communities of color. By way of introduction, I wanted to share a little bit about how we came to this work. I'm actually reminded that earlier this week, we marked the 1-year anniversary of the killing of George Floyd by the Minneapolis Police Department. And it might actually surprise you to learn, but it was the police killing of another Black person, Corin Gaines, that brought Facebook to our attention. Back in August of 2016, Facebook, at the request of law enforcement, shut down Corin Gaines's Facebook and Instagram accounts. She had been using both to live stream her confrontation with police. And after the stream was shut down, police entered her home, shot and killed her. So, after that tragic event, we went searching for answers. Why would a social media company take an action that would put one of their users in harm's way? Why would they so easily collaborate with police? This was after the Ferguson uprisings, after the killing of Mike Brown, Eric Garner, and so many more. What we found was a company that by design would place Black and brown users in constant harm's way. We discovered that Facebook was letting app developers access user data to create surveillance products that they were selling to police. We found that the platform systematically privileged the speech of white people espousing hateful views, growing the ranks of white supremacist groups on the platform, but routinely censoring its Black and POC users simply for talking about racism. We saw Facebook let coordinated disinformation campaigns thrive on its platform. In fact, one of the largest Black Lives Matter pages on Facebook, with over 700,000 followers at one point, was a page run by a white man in Australia. We saw threats of violence go unchecked, like last summer during the uprisings following the killing of George Floyd, when Donald Trump, emboldened, posted, when the looting starts, the shooting starts, emboldening, police brutality, and emboldening his white supremacist base that supported him. Here's the thing. The problem isn't that bad things can fall through the cracks as platforms like Facebook and Google get bigger. The platforms are big because of all the bad things. Facebook and Google have generated massive profits by enabling the spread of racist and hateful content that generates clicks and discriminates against its most vulnerable users. And these companies promising to self-regulate has not worked. Changes in policies at the platform level are constantly undermined when at a whim, someone like Mark Zuckerberg can play judge and jury. The oversight board, which Facebook propped up as this sort of independent decision-making body, has relegated all decisions back to Facebook on some of its most controversial decisions. Fining them for their most egregious behavior, like the recent $5 billion fine from the Federal Trade Commission, is a drop in the bucket for a company that annually makes over $80 billion. This Congress and this administration have a responsibility to break up these tech giants. The murder of Corin Gaines taught us at Media Justice 5 years ago that the actions of these platforms can lead to real offline harm. January 6th taught lawmakers that these harms can make their way to the Capitol. The time is now to hold these platforms accountable, and the only just thing to do is to break them up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephen. We are really honored to have Media Justice and all that you all represent and are doing as part of this coalition to fight for racial justice. And you're an important part, so we're very happy to have you. And so I'm just gonna close this out, and I wanna thank all of our speakers. Not all of them can be on the screen simultaneously, but you've heard from all of them. When I think what really this coalition demonstrates, and even just a small subset of new members that we've had speak today, is just the diversity of the types of harms, of the types of organizations that are starting to focus on this issue. And this is not a little niche tech issue, right? These are organizations, also people that couldn't be part of the event today, who represent millions of people in this country, right? And so this needs to be one of our top economic, racial, social justice priorities, breaking up these companies. And big tech is brazen right now. Facebook and Google will do whatever they can and spend however much money it takes to stop the government from doing what's necessary to stop the harms that have just been mentioned in today's event. And so we have to be even stronger. We have to be stronger to fight against their ability to profit off of these conspiracy theories, the clickbait, to kill competition, prevent small businesses from being able to play in the market at all, and absolutely destroying innovation. We've got to do it together. We can do it together, and one-off regulations are not going to be enough. And so I hope you've also heard today is that this is a people-powered movement, and we are demanding that the Biden administration and Congress use their power to break up these business models, to break up Facebook and Google, and truly set us all free. Because right now, another theme that's come up today is that we are not free. We are not free as workers, as small businesses, as people that are vulnerable, as long as they continue to maintain this power. So join us. We need you. If you're an organization that has not joined the coalition yet, you are welcome. If you're an individual that just wants to be part of the movement, that is also very much needed. And go to freedomfromfacebookandgoogle.com. Join us today. We will be in touch with more to come. So thank you again to all of our new members. Thank you to the original members. Thank you to Senator Warren and Congressman Jones for joining us, and all of our speakers today for making the point of why we must break them up.